Good evening, everyone. My name is Patricia Kranz. I'm the executive director of the Overseas Press Club, and we're delighted to have you join us this evening to talk to the winners of the Roy Rowan Award for Best Investigative Reporting in Any Medium on an International Story. And the winners are Michael Schwirtz, Dionne, Searcey, David Kirkpatrick, and Malachy Brown with the Visual Investigations team at the New York Times. And speaking with them tonight is the head judge of the Rowan Award, Jim Steele. So I pass it over to you, Jim. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patricia. I want to congratulate all members of the Times team for this really remarkable story. Both the stories and the videos are quite exceptional, and we're glad that four of you are here tonight to talk about this. I also want to welcome all of those who are watching this webinar either now or in the future, and feel free to post any questions that you may have, and we'll try to get to those at the end of our session. I guess we all know at this point so well about Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election, but not so well known is how the Russians are doing similar kinds of things across the world, but with much more dire consequences, spreading a kind of poison among many nations of the world. We see in this Times package that we're honored, we're talking about tonight, the scope of the deception, the thuggery, bribery, murder, all aimed at destabilizing other, in many cases, less powerful nations. And of course, enhancing Putin's power along the way. I want to tell you, in this particular category, the Roy Rowan Award, there were many, many extremely fine entries, many worthy of awards in their own right. But the Times package really stood out. It stood out for the quality of the reporting, the courage of the reporters, the extraordinary gifted use of data and crosstabs, the writing, of course, and finally, what stood out was the message it sent about the kind of evil coming out of Russia today. I think people know this in a way, but there's something about the graphic nature of many of the stories that are part of this project that hit home with all of us who were on the jury and made the determination to award this to the Times Project. The degree of this was just astonishing. I'm talking about Moscow-directed assassination squads, sophisticated disinformation campaigns, the slaughtering of innocent civilians. These are all now pages in the Kremlin's foreign policy playbook. We have tonight four of the Times journalists who produced this impressive project: Malachy Brown, Michael Schwirtz, Dionne, Searcey, and David Kirkpatrick. And now we're going to ask them to tell us more about Russia's shadow war. Malachy, could we start with you?
Sure, Jim. So the series of stories that we produced on the Visual Investigations team looked at the phenomenon of healthcare under attack in Syria. Russia is a military partner of the Syrian government. And in 2019, during an offensive, a government offensive in the northwest part of Syria, an area called Idlib, hospitals again came under attack. And it was a pattern that we had seen in previous offensives. The data showed that, as the airstrikes increased, attacks on civilian infrastructure, including hospitals in particular, increased. And many of these hospitals were on a no-strike list that the United Nations had collected for protected sites. They collected the latitude and longitude coordinates from these places and distributed them to the warring parties, including Russia. Hospitals were struck so frequently, and some of them repeatedly, that it appeared that it could be no accident. But assigning blame for specific attacks was very difficult until we, in investigating several of these attacks, obtained audio recordings of pilots carrying out their missions. And those recordings were time coded, which was essential, as I'll show. I've got a couple of slides prepared to walk through an example of one of those attacks. They were time coded, and the recordings were between ground control and the pilots, and sometimes they shared the coordinates of their targets as well. And we decoded over many months. We had 3 Russian speakers on the team. We decoded those pilot recordings in spreadsheets, and the terminology that they used spoke to former Soviet pilot, defected Syrian pilot, because we also had recordings of the Syrian Air Force, and looked at repeated bombings of hospitals. 72 were bombed that we know of, between hospitals and other medical facilities in Syria in 2019, and we examined several of those. And if you like, I can walk you just through what some of that evidence looked like. Let's see. You see that screen?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So let's see. And if anybody wants to see these stories, there's the URL. Bit of a plug. Visual Investigations on the Times, and there's a collection of this body of work there. In Syria, airstrikes in civilian areas became so frequent that there was a network of observers that were visually observing aircraft as they took off and where they went to, and they were in radio communications with each other, and they would tweet out the locations in a central from a central database. But they were also listening into the open frequencies that the pilots were using, much like police scanner in the US. And somebody had the clever idea of recording those, and so we got access to months and months of recordings, which we were able to validate through a number of means. And this is just a spreadsheet of one of those days, which was May 5th, 2019, when 4 hospitals were bombed in a 12-hour period. And that was the first day that we started looking. You can see the coordinates are being shared. 52 is the pilot's number. Titan is the code name for the ground control. And so each of these are very precisely time coded as well. And in the translations, we detected a pattern. They would receive coordinates, they would correct the coordinates sometimes, they would calculate the minute they're going to strike, get confirmation from ground control, and then confirm that they had striked it by saying worked it, or sent candy, or puck sent, or they had these different code words. Different pilots had different code words. And the challenge for us in documenting specific attacks on hospitals was there was ample media. We know Syria is one of the most documented conflicts. There's lots of open source material, as we call it, on social media. And for us, we were turning those open sources into primary sources and getting the media of the airstrikes sent directly from the witnesses, from their devices, and they were imprinted with the hour, minute, and second that those photographs or videos were recorded. And by cross-corroborating that with multiple other sources of information, you're able to relate what's going on the ground with what's going on in the sky. And particularly when hospitals like this one are hit 3 times in a row at a specific interval. We as you can see here, we got the CCTV footage from inside this hospital, and the CCTV footage was time-stamped. And every time the bomb hit the hospital, it shuddered, and you could see that second. So we're looking at that, and we're corresponding to Pilot 31, who we know is bombing in that area, and the times that he confirms that he's worked it or hit his target. And then, although the time codes are off a little bit, the intervals are almost precise. And that's because there's 2 different clock systems at play there. And when we realized that, we got back in touch with the hospital and said, hey, could you record the security system as the minute changes? And we were able to calibrate how that clock system was off, and kind of use it as a yardstick. And then doing that multiple, repeated times. There were other witnesses who were outside who filmed the second and third airstrike. And then these logs that are sent out in real time also recorded Russian aircraft attacking in those minutes. And often in the videos as well, the witnesses will pan up to the sky and you can see the model of aircraft, and knowing what aircraft the Syrian Air Force uses and the Russian Air Force uses, whether they're fixed wing, the camouflage that they use, all of that became essential as well. And this is that same hospital as well. Before and after satellite imagery helped us. And then slowing down, going frame by frame through it, we got some understanding of the weaponry that they were using as well. And we spoke to experts who study the Russian and Syrian military. And then in talking to witnesses, doctors who worked there, or other people who witnessed it, the messages, retrieving the messages that they sent in real time to their colleagues or to other hospitals in the area, documenting again the time and what they were saying, which also gave us additional reporting. And kind of stitching all of that together and cross-corroborating it, you're able to assign responsibility for attacks on some of these facilities to specific pilots. So that's just kind of one example.
That's just an extraordinary description of how this came about, and just watching it, you get goosebumps seeing what happened. But tell me one more thing, just out of curiosity. Obviously, a source supplied you the audio logs. Is that correct?
Yes.
Great. And I mean, just absolutely amazing piece of work. Maybe what we should do is go on to everybody else, and if there's any questions at the end, we'll field those all at the time. Does that make sense to everybody at this point? So Michael, could you pick it up from here and tell us about your work in Ukraine, and also, I guess it was Madagascar and Bulgaria, as I recall?
Yeah, that's that. There are a lot of countries in there, but I'll wrap it all in. Yeah, and thank you. And compared with Malachy and his team, my reporting, I think our reporting is much more low tech and old school. It sort of began as an attempt to understand kind of the nature and motivation behind Russian intelligence operations. And this came primarily what inspired the project, were on the one hand, the 2016 interference in the presidential election in the United States, but also another Russian intelligence operation, the 2018 poisoning of a former Russian spy for the British in the UK by the name of Sergei Skripal. And what I had wanted to do was get a sense of some of the personalities and the policies behind some of these intelligence efforts that were going on all around the world. And while the 2016 election, the 2018 poisoning garnered a lot of attention, they were just sort of the most visible examples of a huge amount of intelligence activity that had been carried out around Europe, the Middle East, Africa for the last few years, and represented sort of an aggressive push by the Kremlin to make itself more relevant in international affairs, using means that were in many ways underhanded, but also very accessible and commensurate with Russia's abilities. When you're dealing with the intelligence world, it's usually nebulous. So if you look at sort of the collection of stories, they touch on a number of different issues, from kind of pure intelligence operations, military operations, political disinformation operations. But going throughout this project, we chose to dig in wherever an opening appeared for us. So if you look, for instance, at kind of one of the first big story I did in this series was a story about a Russian hitman, and this was very much born of my interest in the subject after the 2018 Skripal poisoning, and I came across this story almost by accident. I had been in Ukraine digging around on the issue of Russian assassinations, because Ukraine is very much a testing ground for this type of activity. In fact, a lot of the intelligence operations that we've seen demonstrated in the West, from election interference to hacking critical infrastructure to assassinations, was first carried out in Ukraine. So I figured this would be a good place to go. And I was sort of beating my head against a wall, as I normally do in these sorts of projects, getting nowhere, when somebody happened to mention to me this trial that was going on in a very small town in the west of Ukraine, involving a hitman who had murdered somebody seemingly sort of unimportant. He was an engineer, a kind of handyman at a local prison. And it sounded interesting to me. I had nothing else going on, and so I decided to go out there and check it out. And that turned into a story that allowed me, almost with, exclusively with this guy's help, allowed me to unpick a bit about how Russia carries out these assassination operations. And what I learned, kind of the big idea that I learned in that story, is that very often, one is that Russia is carrying out these sorts of operations all the time, particularly in Ukraine and the areas on its borders. These sorts of assassinations are not terribly uncommon. What was uncommon is that, I was looking for, highly trained professional intelligence officers of the kind that were involved in this Skripal poisoning in the UK. And what I found was a kind of petty criminal and a sex trafficker who happened to have been at the right place in the right time to be recruited by Russian intelligence and sent on this mission to murder a man with a promise of payment of a few $1,000s and a Mercedes van. And this, I discovered, was a much more common, sort of low grade, almost criminal style, these low grade criminal style murders that were taking place all over this part of the world. That was one story. I did another story. Another story took me to Madagascar, and this is a totally different story. And in fact, a story that was similar to ones that we were doing out of the United States. And this one involved election interference and a huge number of Russian political operatives that were sent, thousands of miles away from Moscow to interfere in an election in Madagascar. This story sort of highlighted a different side of the Russian effort to expand its influence all around the world. And what this involved was just a series of political consultants that branched out and reached out to all of the major candidates in the Madagascar election and offered to assist them in winning the election. And they zeroed in on a specific candidate and ended up focusing on the wrong candidate, in fact. And sort of a lot of these stories that we did, they certainly highlighted the breadth of Russian operations all around the world and Russian efforts to expand its influence, but they did not necessarily highlight or underscore a great deal of competence on their part. So in this Madagascar story, what ended up occurring is the Russians backed the wrong guy. The guy that they pumped resources in, providing hundreds of thousands of dollars for to win this election, in an effort to gain some kind of influence in this very uninfluential country, ended up going south. They ended up backing the wrong guy and having to shift gears and try and curry favor with the man who actually won after the fact. And then I eventually did get around to doing a few more stories about sort of high-level assassinations carried out by the Russian government, and zeroed in on a unit that the Russians had developed to not only carry out assassinations, but carry out these kind of destabilizations all over the world. The unit was designated 29155 as a member of the Russian military intelligence service, and basically their job is to go around the world, go around Europe, and attempt to assassinate enemies of Russia, and or carry out operations aimed at destabilizing various countries in the region. So I focused on Bulgaria, particularly where this group attempted twice to poison a Bulgarian arms dealer who was doing business with some of Russia's enemies, particularly Ukraine. These groups were also involved. This group was also involved in the Skripal poison, which I mentioned, as well as an attempted coup in Montenegro, and they continue to sort of carry out operations and are active around Europe to this day, as far as we know. We're sort of still getting bits and pieces of information about things they might be up to at current time. So we might have some future stories on those as well. And so really, just to sum up, and I'll pass it on to Dionne and David so they can talk about their really interesting reporting. And basically, the goal here was to reveal the inner workings of the Kremlin's push to extend its influence abroad, using an array of tools from the military, the intelligence services, to political operations, and sort of dissect those in different places all over the world.
That sounds great. And before we go on to you, Dionne, I just want to say one thing. You're talking about old school versus maybe new school. There's a lot of wonderful stuff in your old school reporting. I'm putting the old school in quotes, by the way. And I thought the character, the assassin in Ukraine, was something out of a Russian novel, in the sense that here's this low-level guy who's about to commit this assassination. And what's he thinking about? He's thinking about, well, maybe I'll get a pension. It's like all these bizarre things that seem totally unrelated to the horror that's about to be perpetrated. So a lot of great quotes in that, as well as your other ones. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hello, Dionne. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can. Thanks.
Love to hear about the situation in the Central African Republic.
Sure. So I kind of more or less stumbled into the Russia series here with I was West Africa bureau chief, and I was covering 25 countries, and I had heard about the murders of 3 Russian journalists in the Central African Republic. But at the time I was pretty caught up in the war in Nigeria against Boko Haram, and that was just my area of focus for the moment. And by the time I kind of turned my attention back to the Central African Republic, I'd never been there before. There had been Russian outlets and others who had tried to investigate those murders and found nothing. And I kind of didn't really feel like I could add to that story. I mean, I wasn't going to go in if the Russians and the Central African Republic government were both complicit in covering up those murders, which it looked like maybe something weird was going on. I didn't really feel like I was going to be able to waltz in there and crack the case. So, but I was wrapping up my stint in West Africa and heading back to America to cover the elections, and had heard from a photographer friend who had been there on assignment, one who I work with pretty closely, Ashley Gilbertson, and he had called me from there because he was on assignment for doing like a humanitarian work or working for an NGO, a quick assignment there, and had been out to some refugee camps and had seen a woman in a displaced persons camp, and had seen a woman selling onions by the quarter. Like she was so poor, both she was so poor and her buyers were so poor that they could only afford, to buy a quarter of an onion. And was really moved by that. And I had always that was kind of stuck in the back of my head. I'm like, okay, before I leave West Africa, I'm going to go to the Central African Republic. And I was really nervous about going. I didn't really want to wade into the Russian situation at all. I was pretty terrified because they had killed people there. So we allegedly, we were worried that they had killed people there. And so I decided I would just go and write about the peace agreement was happening and with rebel forces. And it seemed like a good opportunity to go tell a humanitarian story. There was a bit of a news hook with the situation. So I went without any intention of getting involved in Russian activities or reporting on that, and went to a pediatric hospital, went to a refugee camp, and then, everywhere I went, I mean, the Russian interference or just presence, I guess, was so in your face, billboards, T-shirts, like guys walking around with "I love Russia" or something on their, on their backs. And it was everywhere. But most obvious were the white pickup trucks of Russians roaming around town, all crammed in the back of the truck, at 5 a.m. with weapons. And they were just everywhere. It was unavoidable. And so I just slowly started, collecting a little bit of reporting, and everywhere I went and people would talk about it. Oh yeah, I see them in the bars. And then just kind of cobbled together little bits and pieces, meeting with diplomats, to talk about the humanitarian situation, and then weaseling in a couple of questions about Russia in the end. And then started sort of collecting an assortment of warlords. And it just seemed interesting. The warlords were really involved in the peace agreement and becoming part of the government. And so I had a reason to talk to them. And that didn't have anything to do with Russia. And my fixer was too afraid to show his face to them or to even call them for me. So he basically just gave me his Rolodex of warlord cell phone numbers. And I called various warlords and took a taxi with Ash, the photographer, and we just showed up in the living room or the compound of various warlords and talked to them. And they just would start volunteering things about the Russians and how the Russians had, how Prigozhin had shown up at this conference in, I think it was in Sudan, where he helped negotiate the peace process. I mean, it was some of the first things that they talked about were the Russian involvement. And then these warlords also were involved in diamond trafficking, which is a huge issue there. And we started talking to diamond dealers who also, had involvement with Russians. And really it was kind of a subcontext of every conversation I had with everyone. And I did the bulk of my reporting really after I left. I mean, I didn't call the Russians for comment when I was there or anything. I was really afraid. And so I kind of laid the groundwork and built up source relationships when I was on the ground, and then really, really delved in and asked more pointed questions and had help from our Moscow bureau too. But to start getting more sources and talking to more people after I was out of the country and safe. It's and that trip really on its own was one of the wildest trips, even without the Russians. I mean, I was on a prop plane that was forced down by lightning, and that was, I think, the third scariest thing that happened to me that day. So, we were tailed by security forces, encounters with drunk police, almost attacked by an angry mob with bricks, and none of that had to do with the Russians. So it was a pretty, it's a crazy place. And, but I really felt a lot of compassion for the people there, and did end up doing a couple humanitarian stories also about a pediatric hospital and just other stories about displaced people that I really feel like were just as relevant as the Russian reporting too.
Excellent.
Yeah.
I was struck so much in your story. One of the themes that just sort of emerged out of it was just the unbelievable ruthlessness of the Russians. I mean, the way they're backing up the national government there, and the fact that it's not a normal influence peddling thing. I mean, they were like running the show.
Yeah, I mean, they really were. And, they were taking advantage of a country that's been in crisis for many, many years.
Right.
And, and a country that's so, so poor. And the people, I mean, they were paying bribes outright. I had a list of, like, basically a receipt of all that a source gave me of all the people in parliament who had received a bribe to vote for a particular politician. And I remember my editor saying, like, why did they keep a receipt of that? And I'm like, it's just like what they do. They want to know, like, who did what. And so, it's just a very vulnerable population. I think that's what, all our reporting has shown, is that, the Russians also take advantage of the vulnerable.
Exactly, in whatever state they're in.
Yeah.
So David, could we hear from you?
I hope so. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. We can see you too.
So my story was in Libya. I likewise sort of stumbled into it. There were rumors of Russian involvement in Libya, more than a year ago. And the U.S. State Department was playing it down too. The American officials were all saying, we know the Russians, they like, General Haftar, one of the factions fighting in Libya, and they try to help him, but it's not a big deal. They're just making trouble on the cheap. But I said to them, I really want to know what's going on here. This seems like a bigger deal. And what's more, it's a twofer, because the conflict in Libya has also become the first international conflict fought primarily with drones, right? The two sides of the conflict, one with drones from China, the other with drones from Turkey, were really battling it out in the air. So if this Russian thing doesn't pan out, we've got a perfectly good drone war. So it turned out that both were quite interesting to me. I had a chance to talk to the soldiers about what it's like to engage in a combat that is really dominated by drones, about how it's sensitive, that each drone can only fire so many missiles and then has to go back, that the enemy can only run 3 drones at a time. So when the 3 drones each launch their 8 missiles, you've got another hour before they roll back again for the next round of bombs. Anyway, all that was very interesting, but the Russians were more interesting. The trick when I got there was to get close to the front. Libya is dangerous always. It's dangerous even to sit in your hotel for fear of kidnapping. And I prefer to travel without a big burly, former military looking security guard, because that's quite conspicuous. So I kind of kept light on my feet and tried not to get too much notice. The breakthrough for me was getting up to the front line and visiting a field hospital there. I managed to show up at a lull in the fighting, and they spoke very vividly. The doctors there spoke very vividly about the quality of the wounds they were seeing from the Russian forces, that the Russians had sent snipers. The snipers were using hollow point bullets, which the Libyans had been unfamiliar with. And whereas most Libyan fighters are really kind of amateurish, picture mixed matched fatigues and flip-flops basically with an AK. These guys didn't miss, right? They were soldiers dropping dead from the first shot to the head or the chest, and the bullet didn't leave the body because it was one of these hollow points. And they were terrified. The Libyan soldiers who found themselves facing Russian mercenaries had never met anything like that. And they were in fairly rapid retreat. The Russians at that time appear to have sent in only a couple of hundred mercenaries, but because of the amateurishness of the Libyan forces, they were really pushing back the frontiers very steadily. It emerged also that they had sent refurbished old Sukhoi airplanes, more sophisticated artillery. They had spotters in there. working to operate their higher quality artillery. All of this was just devastating and was really tilting what had been a stalemate in the Libyan civil war in terms of the Russians' preferred side. It also became clear that they weren't going to leave, that by sending these 200, 300, maybe 400 mercenaries, they had established, the Russians had established for themselves a permanent position as a spoiler. You know, they were going to have a decisive say in whatever the outcome of the Libyan conflict. And this, after all, was a conflict precipitated in part by the American support for the uprising in 2011. So the United States had gone in, been greeted as liberators, invested a lot of money, and then seen the all this taken from them, and now set to be largely determined by the Russians. So that was all very interesting, and set me on the trail of a couple other stories I did after that, looking at what the U.S. role had been in backing this conflict the Russians had then intervened to exploit, and also what was going on under the rule of their preferred client, General Khalifa Haftar, in the eastern part of the country. The challenge in writing it, of course, is Libya is just a heck of a complicated situation, and so weaving in the kind of geopolitics and the who's backing which side and why, with the more vivid details about the nature of the sniper's weapons, was a real writing challenge.
Well, I think it worked very well. And one of the points you just made, which really jumped out for me as a reader, was this contrast between this ragged army on the ground and this very sophisticated war in the air. I mean, it's something I just never thought of. It makes absolute sense in terms of drones, but that was I thought, a great contrast that made you understand why this is a different kind of war than most of us think wars are about. So I thought that was a very effective way to do that. Chad, do we have any questions?
We do not have questions queued up at the moment, but if anybody wants to put some questions in the chat, we will get to them.
Oh, okay. I saw something down there and I thought we had some. Well, I can go ahead and ask some questions then, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, the whole process by which you were operating in these countries, some things you were mentioning, David, that you didn't want a burly bodyguard. Dionne, I'm not sure, was it just the photographer who was with you?
Yeah, we didn't have security or anything. I had a fixer that I used from time to time, but yeah.
And obviously in Ukraine, I guess it's a little, maybe they're a little bit more used to some Westerners, but perhaps not. I don't know. I mean,
it's pretty easy to work in Ukraine.
Ukraine is easier than a couple of these other places, but I guess
depending upon the eastern part is still dicey because of the conflict, but largely easy to work in.
Let me ask you a question, Michael, because you wrote that story about this fascinating Russian unit that's been operating in Europe for some time, that's spreading all this mayhem. And I think there was a quote or a suggestion in one of your pieces about one of the difficulties is that nobody really knows where they're going to be next, where they're going to strike next. I assume the Europeans are quite concerned about the kind of disruption that they can cause, maybe not so much in Europe per se, but in their former colonies, places in Africa, perhaps, that they want to have more influence. What do you see that unit continuing to do? Getting stronger, more mayhem, more targets, than we catch up with it a year or two after it's happened?
It's hard to say. One, because these sorts of organizations like to operate in secret, and one of the things that has happened over the last few years is that so much has come out about these guys, not just in our reporting, but elsewhere. There's an amazing organization called Bellingcat, which uses access to public records like telephone data and flight logs that are accessible on various dark websites to be able to basically out these people. And so a lot of the people who've been involved in this, their names have become known in the public, and in this sense, it prevents them from doing their work. And a lot of these guys are highly trained to do this sort of thing, and they're used to operating in the shadows. And if their pictures and their identities have been splashed all over the internet, then I don't think they're going to be doing that sort of thing much longer. That said, Putin is a foreign affairs guy. He doesn't take much interest in what is happening domestically so long as things there are stable. He sees himself as primarily somebody who is going to make Russia a great power and a power to be reckoned with again. And these are some of the tools that he uses to do that. His operations in Syria are primarily with that goal in mind. In Syria and Libya and everywhere else are primarily backed by the Kremlin with that goal in mind, to expand Russia's influence and make it a force to be reckoned with. And in many cases, that's worked, right? Russia basically owns the Syrian conflict. You can't do anything in Syria right now without Russia's participation. You can't bypass Russia in Syria. You can't bypass Russia in Libya. And while Russia is never going to play the role of nation builder, they're probably not going to clean up the mess that they've left behind in Russia or Libya. They're still the force to be reckoned with. So I think these operations are going to continue. The Russians are very creative in using what little resources they have to project might abroad. The question is whether sort of some changes that are happening inside of Russia might divert attention from these things. But people have been sort of predicting that upheaval inside of Russia would cause a reckoning for the Kremlin to come for years, and it hasn't happened. So I would imagine that these sorts of things are going to keep happening.
That reminds me of something earlier in my youth. After Fidel Castro took over Cuba, every year there were predictions that he would be overthrown. So once an autocrat gets in control and has certain other things going for him, it's sometimes very hard to extricate.
I think Putin's position is pretty solid.
At the
moment.
Exactly. Dionne, one thing I was fascinated by your story, which you didn't say this, but it kind of, to me, it bubbled up out of it. And I think the same thing would probably be true of, in some ways, the Madagascar story. It's like many of the former colonies are in effect becoming colonies again, not of the countries that they used to be colonies of, like France, like the Central African Republic, but now they're in effect a colony of Russia. And
yeah, I mean, you can really see that a lot, and people talk pretty openly about that. I mean, in fact, I remember talking to one warlord who told me that he was like, we're loyal to France. They colonized us. We don't want these Russians coming in. It was this very weird mentality. But I think, like, especially in these places that have all these resources, I mean, there's so many diamonds in the Central African Republic, and they're not that hard to get. And there's, just controlling one mine can lead to all kinds of riches and such, and a lot of foreign interests are out there. And you can see the same thing. I guess some people would say you can see similar ideas with China coming into a lot of West African or African nations, right, and building all the infrastructure, and
right.
And then what? That's the big worry there. So it's colonization under a different form, but it feels like that's a risk here for sure.
In your story, and also Michael's, and forgive me, I can't remember the name of the oligarch.
Yevgeny Prigozhin.
Yes, that's our boy. In both your stories, there was quite a bit of background about his business interests. And I'm just curious, just as somebody who's fascinated by that kind of thing. Where do you find information on somebody like him? What are the various sources that you were both able to plumb that revealed a lot of his interests?
I think Michael can talk about it better than me, but I'll just tell you for my part quickly, since he'll have the bulk of the information, is I had company registration records because they had registered some of the mining interests and other things in for some mines in the Central African Republic. There were just
okay.
government documents. Yeah.
Okay, so even there, all right. I'm just.
I had similar. I had contracts for mining operations that were linked to companies owned or controlled by Prigozhin. I was also able to take advantage of a leak of internal communications and flight records belonging to Prigozhin's company in St. Petersburg, and so I had. Was able to look at some of the communications between some of the individuals as they were describing their operations in Madagascar, which was really interesting.
And for me, the guy showed up at the peace talks, so
Right.
Yeah,
I love that photo. Yeah, that was.
And he's popped up in Libya, right, David?
Yeah. I was just going to say, he has been very involved in spearheading the Russian efforts in Libya, and thanks to Michael's help with his excellent Russian, I was able to translate some documents that we obtained that some operatives for Mr. Prigozhin had left behind when they were arrested in Tripoli, that revealed some of his business interests in Libya. That were might have been ways for him to get paid off from inside Libya for the involvement of his mercenaries.
When I read all of your pieces, I thought the United States has sort of we've never been great with our outward look. I understand that. I mean, in terms of the US, it's such a big country. We're very inward. But it seems like we've been even more so the last 3 or 4 years. It's like the rest of the world is going on. Putin is exerting more and more influence in various places. And we're obsessed by some domestic things, and that's okay. But we've sort of let the rest of the world kind of drift, I think. Any thoughts on that? Or is it just, I mean, all of you have been in various forms of international reporting for a while, so maybe it's no different than it ever was, but it seems to me the last few years, our inwardness has gotten even more pronounced.
Yeah, I think in the Central African Republic, the void filled by America really not having a huge amount of interest. I mean, they never had a giant interest, but also there it was France. France had pulled out, and so that was also a huge factor there.
It was the same. It was the same actually in Madagascar. That it was the recession of France from the scene that allowed the Russians to come in and really take a foothold. France had long been sort of the power that Madagascar worked with, and economically, since independence, economically speaking. Though I think when I'm not sort of on the road, I spend a good deal of time at the UN, and certainly there it's I think most evident, or a place where it's starkly evident, the disappearance of the U.S. as a player. The U.S. took very little, especially in the last few years after Nikki Haley stepped down as the ambassador. Took very little interest in what was going on at the UN, and took a very kind of imperious and bullying tone, particularly with allies, that I think was very unwelcome. And I think that allowed for not just Russia, which is a permanent member of the Security Council, but also and more visibly China to come in and start taking over positions within the United Nations system that were previously dominated by the U.S.
In Libya, it's a similar story with a sort of middle step. after engaging in the uprising in 2011, the US really pulled back and then for a while did nothing as several American allies fought with each other in a proxy war there. For a while, Egypt, the UAE, Qatar, and Turkey were fighting among themselves. And then in 2019, it was Russia that stepped in to kind of play the kingmaker role.
Tell me a little about what it's like on the ground in these countries right now in terms of safety and security and or access to information. What are some of the biggest obstacles that each of you faced in these various places? I'm just curious.
I think Dionne and David probably face the most serious obstacles. So I'll just say, for my part, it was pretty smooth for me in all the countries that I worked in. I keep in tabs with. We have a security consultant that we work with that I keep in tabs with, who checks in on me if I haven't, been in contact for a few days. But otherwise, I didn't run into any trouble. So I know that Dionne and David had a bit more harrowing experiences.
I had like a lot of, we go way out into the countryside and, driving, the roads aren't very good. And so you're a million miles away, and we ran into some problems like with curfews. I think we were about 6 hours from the capital by car, and the curfew was at 5 and it was noon, and we really wanted to talk to a diamond dealer. And so we just figured, well, hopefully we'll get back in. So we were allowed back in. But a lot of the countryside is controlled by various rebel groups. And so you have to go through checkpoints. And with every checkpoint, you drive past, you kind of just hold your breath and hope that nothing bad will happen. And we were lucky in that way, nothing happened there. But, it's just, I didn't want to be, I think that one of the most scary experiences, we with a photographer and I went to a May Day parade, and we just thought like, oh, it's just like a parade, like a local parade. It'll be weird with the military or whatever. And in fact, it was all the warlords who were now members of the government were there. So there was an array of shady figures. And then also the Russian mercenaries were standing guard over the president. And so it was just like a million of these Russian mercenaries and some French troops and some other people. And, we were very, very, very much on display. And it was like, oh, well, if they didn't know we're here, they know now.
They know now.
Yeah, it was a little worrying.
Yeah, I can imagine. And David, you were going to say something, I think?
No, but I can. I mean, the thing about Libya is it's fundamentally lawless. And in control of that territory is really been captured by a kind of loose alliance of local militias, which are themselves quasi-criminal. So they're all kind of running security rackets, selling security, including to the government and extorting the government and profiting off of the central bank. And those are the good guys in that part of town. And they're fighting against a General Haftar backed by the Russians. So you've got the Emirati drones, or in the air, the Russian snipers on the ground, and then the people you're embedded with, so to speak, are themselves a little dicey. So it's not a place to hang around.
Tell me, all of you, one other kind of overall question. Did kind of this series in a way just sort of come together as the first one that we looked at was yours, Michael. But then did people just sort of generally see other things were there, or was it a matter in the case of both you, David and Dionne, whether you just came upon this as you were in these countries? I think you were saying, David, you came upon the Russian presence.
Yeah, I mean, I was in Libya at the start of the uprising in 2011, and so I've continued to follow it even when most of our editors and probably our readers had largely lost interest. So I think like Dionne, I have a kind of feeling for and concern about the people of Libya.
Yeah.
So when a new superpower was treading over them in a new way, I just thought I would like to go and see that.
See that. Well, it all pulled together. It's a very powerful package in that sense. You get a feeling for what the Kremlin is doing and the various ways that they're doing it. So, and it's obviously something that's going to be with us for a long period of time.
If I could break in, we do have a question from a viewer. Beth Noble asks, well, first of all, it says, well done to the whole team. And the question is, to what extent did you go to the Russian authorities to ask for comment on these stories before they went to press? Assuming you did, how much did you reveal to them, and did they react? Was there reaction after publication?
I have an answer to that, and I also have a funny story that I can share as well about going to the Russians for comment. I text every time I have a story coming. I always text Putin's spokesman his name is Dmitry Peskov. He's been Putin's spokesman forever, and I text him to let him know that I have a story coming. And if I have any questions for him, I give him usually a sort of sentence outline of what the story is going to be about, and ask him sort of whether he comments, and he usually responds. If he responds at all, it says something like, oh, once again, don't come, don't. He usually is dismissive. Actually, he says, this is not a question for the president of the Russian Federation. This is a question for some other bureaucrat down the line. Which, of course, if you send questions to them, you get nothing. But I also, in the stories where I wrote about people and named names, I try to reach out to all of them. So the Madagascar story, I actually had spreadsheets with names and phone numbers, and in some cases email addresses of all the Russian operatives who were working in Madagascar. And I wrote and called and texted each of them several times, trying to get them to talk. But I usually don't reveal too much about what I'm writing about, because I was burned once. We did a big story. We broke a big story a few years ago about a massive Russian doping program in the Winter Olympics in Sochi, the Olympics that they hosted. And we had them sort of nailed on the story, and I went to them several days before, both the sports ministry and the Kremlin, and basically laid out point by point all of the accusations that we were making in this article, only to discover a few hours later that they had leaked this to TASS with their own spin on it, and basically, allowed them to do a story, kind of quasi scooping us, and sort of trying to undermine the story ahead of time. So I avoid doing that at this point.
Yeah, for each of ours, we sent questions and documented our findings, and in each case they referred to previous press statements, and it's kind of par for the course with them. Sometimes they'll use visual evidence to try to support their case and say, look, this hospital wasn't bombed. Bellingcat has the group that Michael mentioned earlier has a good sort of takedown of one of these refutations, where if you actually move the satellite image over and you show the other wing of the hospital, you can see that in fact they did bomb it, but they're being very selective in what they're saying. And they also, once our story came out, said not since World War II has Russia shared coordinates over open radio communications. And so first of all, they say we don't use open radio communications, and then they say not since World War II have we shared coordinates. But there was the first day that we looked at, there were 21 targets with coordinates, and we're able to validate that by looking at satellite imagery to see that in fact all of these targets were hit. So it was, you couldn't make it up, or you couldn't manufacture this evidence. And no response from Syria.
And I had sent via our Moscow bureau, because I don't have any contacts for the Kremlin. They had sent a reporter in the bureau had sent an email asking for comment or a text or something, and they wrote back this very long-winded, first they like castigated us for like having a reporter that wasn't well known to them, like not the bureau chief or something. I don't really understand. They even were angry about that and even wrote Dean Baquet, the editor of the New York Times, about that. And then sent back this very long, winding response, of course, denying everything. And then because I'd asked them about some of the humanitarian, they had, injured or tortured someone and allegedly, and they shot back with allegations about the French and said, you need to look into the French having sex with dogs in some particular region. I was like, that's like not something I expected. But we chose not to include that in our story. That part.
That's the mark of a classic propagandist or PR person, deflection.
Yeah, it was pretty good. It was not at all what I expected.
Yeah, no, that's not bad. Chad, are any other questions?
We just had the one, and
Just the one.
we fielded it. Yep, thank you.
Well, I guess we're about roughly an hour. If anybody else has anything to say, go ahead. But otherwise, I just want to thank everyone for coming forward. It was a great, I'm not sure the word joy is the right one, but it was quite an experience to view and to read this entire project. All of it put together is a very powerful statement, and it comes across in multiple ways. So you're all to be commended for that. And I know how hard these things are, though I must say I haven't had to be in some of the places all of you have been in. But I think that even adds another layer to what a resourceful and great accomplishment this is. So I want to congratulate you all and thank you for participating in this, and I wish you well in all your ongoing endeavors. So,
Well, thank you, Jim.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Jim, and thank to all of you. It was a really fascinating conversation.
great.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Take care.
Good night.
Bye.
Bye.